Okay, hi everybody. Good to see you again.
Hi.
Been a while. So
Yeah, yeah.
here's our agenda, which we'll try to follow today fairly closely. Um, I'll just mention a couple of announcements here. The one that's on the agenda is that I think we're going to try to resume our in-person meetings in January. We'll give it a try and do it hybrid so we can bring people in remotely who don't live near Brattleboro. But if you're in the area and like to attend in person, please come. We'll start it at 11 a.m. and run it till 1 p.m. My request is still pending at the library, but I'm sure they'll approve it. So that's one of the announcements. The other one that we talked about, maybe just alerting people to, and I'll just go along and share the screens here. So we have like to make people aware who aren't already that we do have a YouTube channel. We record all these meetings, so after some light editing, we put them up on our YouTube channel. We actually submit them to Brattleboro Community Television, and they rebroadcast them. So just an alert, if you don't want yourself to be recognized, you can turn off your video or whatever. But it does become a public sort of a public video for people. So at any rate, and if you want, just you can subscribe to the channel, and then whenever anything goes up on, let's say you miss a meeting, we record it, and when it goes up, you'll get alerted to that video going up on the channel. And that's real easy to do. So if you're not a member, you just hit subscribe and a little bell. You click on that, and that'll alert you. Here's the bell. So see, I have some that I'm waiting for. These are alerts that have been new videos on channels that we subscribe to. So the other thing to share this morning is once I can find it here is the American Ancestors, which is the website of the New England Genealogical and Historical Society, the oldest genealogical society in the world. And they have a real interesting website. And if you subscribe to them with a fee, you can get access. And Wayne does. I don't anymore. But I believe both Rockingham and Brooks still subscribe. So if you go into the libraries, you can use it using their Wi-Fi. You can get access to the databases, and Wayne knows them very well. But for free, you can download a number of research guides, and getting started with Irish records, U.S. World War 1812 records.
Jerry, the screen didn't
Yeah.
change.
Oh, it didn't.
No.
So you're not seeing American Ancestors?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, then let's change that. Then okay. Okay. How about now?
There we go.
Okay. Okay. Great. All right. So that's what we have, and Wayne reminded me that under the tools section here, there's a video library. And if you click on that, you'll get to access video webinars on various aspects of doing genealogical research. And that can be very, very valuable too. And I think that was probably all I had.
Jerry, did you try it out
Yeah.
with that free research thing? Is it it's under that tools menu?
Yes.
The one you were referring to the start, research guides,
Yeah.
free
Right.
guides. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And what got me, what reminded me to do this today was that I got an email yesterday about a new research guide that they have released that you can download for free, and it was I'm surprised they don't have it at the top here because it was a new one, but it's on doing numbering genealogical charts and systems. There's the register style, which goes from an ancestor and moves forward in time, and then there's another one called the I can't pronounce it. Do you know how to pronounce that? Often toddle.
I call it a pedigree thing, but
Oh,
it's
okay.
on
Yeah,
on
you
it
go
on
ahead,
a
explain.
TOEFL, something like
Yeah,
that.
right, right.
And they're
And
just basically like starting with yourself and moving back in time.
right, exactly. That's how that works. Yeah. And the I'll show you kind of what it looks like here. If I can so I'll go back to the agenda, and that didn't work. Let's see, where's the other? All right.
And the screen didn't change yet, Jerry.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Okay.
Okay.
Did that work? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things you get. So this is really a valuable resource for free. So, you know, take some time and go through some of those all you got to do is give them your email address. So, and you'll probably get them their newsletters and so forth.
I'm a little
Okay.
surprised they've changed this to offer those things for free because in the past they've
Yeah.
been selling them for,
That you're right. You're
you
right.
know.
And they'll probably, they probably still do or certain ones, and that'll just get, lure you to their bookshop, and you can buy them as well. But yeah, you're right. I know that's true. They used to be just you'd have to buy them. So okay, why don't if the chat is open, so if you want to introduce yourselves and where you're from. I noticed we had some people from Florida and California attending, and New York, besides Vermont. So you can go ahead and introduce yourselves. Um, Once we start the presentations, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself so there's no, barking dogs or anything like that in the background. And go ahead and pose your questions in the chat, and then we can go back and read them after the presentation, or it depends on Wayne and Jessie. If they want to address them during their presentation, that's fine too. So, whatever works for people. And everything's being recorded, so just let you know that we have 15 people in the session now. So why don't I stop the share here, and we'll get back to our faces. And what I'm going to do is once Jessie starts speaking, I will then focus on her as the speaker. Right now we're in gallery mode. And so just a little intro for Jessie Haas. She lives in Westminster and has been writing books for the past 40 years. And you have what, 40 books? That's a book a year, is that right, Jessie?
41, yeah.
41, okay.
Yeah, it
And
looks like that's what I did. Not really, but that's the
yeah,
act.
yeah, that's even more than Archer Mayer. So, three passions in Jessie's life are reading, writing, and horses. So, I'll let her take it from here on her talk on the Westminster Massacre.
Okay. Well, I expect that I'm actually the world's leading expert on the Westminster Massacre, largely because nobody else is paying attention to it. But I thought that it would be important for me to just start out by telling the story of what the Westminster Massacre actually was. And then I'll talk about what the research involved. So to tell that story, I have to go back a little ways to 1774. Now, the massacre 250th anniversary is coming up next year. So it took place in March of 1775. 1774 is the year that Massachusetts was in an amazing state of rebellion, what's called the Massachusetts Farmers' Revolution, where the British had cracked down after the Boston Tea Party and imposed their own court officials. They got rid of all the elected officials and put their own loyal court officials in place all over the colony. And the farmers rose in revolt, slightly guided by the revolutionaries in Boston, mostly on their own. And they were nonviolent protests, but they were massive nonviolent protests. The figure that sticks in my mind most is that there were 6,000 men in the streets of Worcester, for instance, unarmed, except for they carried sticks. But that amount of men, they don't need to be armed. And they, all over Massachusetts, they frightened the court officials, the imposed court officials into resigning. In many cases, they fled to occupied Boston, and they closed down all the courts in Massachusetts in protest of the crackdown following the Boston Tea Party. And at the same time, the colonies met in in Congress and to consider what they were going to do about the situation. And there was just a ferment of revolution. There were all these committees of correspondence and people trying to figure out what to do at the grassroots level. I think we're often taught the history from a kind of top down. What were the guys in Boston whose names we all know? What were they doing? But a lot was happening out in the hinterlands. And so what happened in the fall of 1774 is that Isaac Lowe, who was from the Committee of Correspondence in New York, wrote a letter to the county officials here. And I should say, by county, this was then Cumberland County, New York, which comprised the land south of Tunbridge and east of the Green Mountains. So Cumberland, and it was, the county officials were loyal to New York and by and large to Great Britain. And Isaac Lowe, a member of the head of the Committee of Correspondence, wrote them a letter saying, well, what's the sentiment up there? What are people thinking? And they suppressed that letter. They didn't want to answer it, and they didn't want anybody else answering it. But two of the leaders in this area, including Azariah Wright, who was the leader of a purely Whig militia, found out about it and spread the word, and they all converged on the next meeting of the Cumberland County officials and said, oh, by the way, got any interesting letters lately, that we should know about? And they fessed up that, yeah, they had gotten a letter. And so the people there voted they were going to go home to their towns and talk about, well, what were their sentiments, and hold a convention in Westminster, which they did in the fall, in October. And they voted a declaration of nonviolence at that time that sounds pretty, they start out, they're pretty loyal. They describe themselves as true and loyal subjects of our gracious sovereign, King George III of Great Britain, and we will spend our lives and fortune in his service as we will defend our king while he reigns over us, and wish his reign may be long and glorious. So we will defend our just rights as British subjects against every power that shall attempt to deprive us of them while breath is in our nostrils and blood in our veins. So, it's like, okay, starts with boring meetings, but there's a pretty good language, really. And then they have this declaration of nonviolence in this convention. Sensible that the strength of our opposition to the late acts consists in a uniform, manly, steady, and determined mode of procedure, we will bear testimony against and discourage all riotous, tumultuous, and unnecessary mobs which tend to injure the persons or properties of harmless individuals, but endeavor to treat those persons whose abominable principles and actions show them to be enemies to American liberty as loathsome animals not fit to be touched or have any society or connection with. So basically, Tories have cooties. We aren't going to hurt you, but we are not going to touch you either. And they were pleased with themselves. They put forth this resolution, which pretty clearly states that they are not happy with what's going on. This is on the same day that off in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress adopted the so-called Articles of Association, which is basically an embargo against a trade embargo against Great Britain. All the colonies ratified that except New York. And remember, we are New York for purposes of this discussion. So in November, the local towns held a second convention and voted to religiously adhere to the Articles of Association. And they were concerned that they felt it was important to do that because the embargo would have been against them as well if they were not in compliance with it. So colonies that didn't ratify it would be included in the embargo. These were already bad economic times, and people were not looking forward to also being embargoed by their fellow colonies. And so they made it very clear. And then they held a third convention in December, January, talking about court reforms. And they wanted fewer courts. The courts met 4 times a year, and it pulled in, like 80 farmers off of their seasonal work to be on juries and so forth. And, it was too much. And they also had some concerns about the integrity of the courts and whether they were likely to, as there were a lot of people who were in debt, whether they were likely to lose their farms. So that was like the afterthought. That was the third convention. So on March 10th of 1775, they had decided to take further action. They wanted to make their sentiments ultra clear. And so in the pattern, somewhat the pattern of Massachusetts, 40 Whigs from Rockingham visited the chief judge in Chester, Judge Thomas Chandler, and requested that he close the courts as their protest. They wanted the courts closed. And he said, well, I can't do that. I have a murder trial I have to bring forward, but I'm happy to meet you there at court and talk with you about it. And people said to him, well, we're afraid if we do that, you'll bring arms against us. And he promised he would not. So that was where the people went home. Judge Chandler immediately sent word to his fellow judges and the sheriff in the county, what am I going to do? And nobody wanted to close the courts, and they didn't really agree with meeting the Whigs. They very rapidly decided, well, we're going to just get there first and not let them in the building. One of the things that's really clear in reading this record is that there must have been spies in both camps, because almost as soon as the court party had made that decision, the Whigs knew all about it. And they decided, well, no, we'll get there first. I mean, it's really, that game where you put your hands on the baseball bat, and whoever is at the top wins. So we're kind of like that. Whoever is going to get to the court first. So on Monday, March 14th, that is the day before the court opens. That's the day traditionally that the judges and the sheriff would arrive in Westminster in all their pomp and glory. about 100 men met at the Captain Azariah Wright's house. And if you know Westminster, that was down on the flats towards Sand Hill Road. And this is along in the afternoon, you know, I've never been able to figure out that aspect of it. Everybody's trying to get to the courthouse first, but it took them all day. And they didn't do Sunday traveling in those days, so they wouldn't have started on Sunday. But from all over the county, men arrived at Captain Wright's house and took up sticks from his woodpile. So in the full Massachusetts model, they're unarmed men with sticks. We have an account of somebody who wanted to bring his sword as they were marching along, and they wouldn't let him join them unless he left his sword at home. So they were very consciously unarmed. And it was safer for them to be unarmed in a way, because it was criminal for them to gather and protest, but it was a lot more criminal if they had had arms. So they gather at Wright's, they get their staves, and they march up Courthouse Hill and go into the courthouse. And literally 20 minutes later, this is toward the end of the afternoon, the sheriff's posse arrived and the judges, and they were armed, contrary to Judge Chandler's promise. About 17 of them had guns, and they had swords. And there was a standoff. They wouldn't let the judges in. The Sheriff Patterson read the riot act to them, promised to blow a lane through them with his guns, and the clerk of the county clerk was waving pistols, and it was, you know, a lot of profanity. It ended in a standoff. They would not let them into the building. And eventually Judge Chandler arrived. He came late. He was a wishy-washy man, and I imagine he came late. I was kind of hoping maybe it'll all be over by the time I get there. It'll all be decided. But the standoff was ongoing, and he was confronted by the Whigs, who said, "Hey, look, you promised that you wouldn't bring arms." And he said, "Well, this is none of my doing, but I will go out and take away the weapons." And once again, that did not happen. He went out. They decided to stand down, and they went down to the tavern down below Courthouse Hill, the Tory Tavern, where they drank a dinner. The bar bill shows 4 gallons of rum. So they had a pretty liquid dinner and made their plans. And meanwhile, as I like to say, like the left always does, the Whigs in the courthouse sat down and wrote a white paper, you know, wrote out their plans and their principles and what they were going to do. And then it looks to me like all the people who were from Westminster went home. The Judge Chandler promised the protests could stay in the courthouse overnight and wouldn't be harmed. But many of these people were, you know, like just from right up the street. And it appears that they went home and left the others, the ones that were from out of town, to guard the courthouse. And some of them went out to get supper. And many of the Tory party, actually, they claim that they kidnapped a number of them. They captured them as they went out to find supper. I haven't ever found anything that corroborates that, in the sense that there's no story about where they were put or were they released, or, you know, how they were found. So I don't know about that. So just around 11 o'clock that night, and it was a pretty full moon, the people inside the courthouse heard a noise and saw the moon shining on the musket barrels of the court party, which had come up the hill. And at that point, accounts differ a little bit. The court party claimed that they told them to surrender. And then they later claimed that they fired careful warning shots. The Whigs said they just marched straight up to the door and opened fire. And the people had clustered to the door to fend them off. So the doorway was crowded with protesters, and they were shot point blank. And the most famous victim, of course, was William French from Brattleboro, who was shot multiple times in the head and the face and the body. And so they shot them. They ran in over the top of the wounded. And there was a big fight in there. Many of the protesters burst out the front door, following the lead of one of the men from Rockingham, who had said, "Come on, boys, we'll go out the way we came in." And they burst out the front door and ran off. The Whigs ran away to Captain Wright's farm down on the flats to figure out what are they going to do. And then the part that's a real atrocity is French was terribly wounded, and they dragged him into the cell with other prisoners and just, mocked his dying groans and said, "Oh, you'll be in hell by morning," and, laughed at him. And, just horrible, a horrible act. So overnight, Captain Wright sent riders everywhere, all over the county, over into New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The next morning, the militia began to gather, and this time they were armed. They were furious, and they had their guns. And by the end of the day, which was filled with threats and new militia groups coming up and lots of drums in the streets, kind of almost more like a French Revolution scene. I've always thought it must have been a pretty wild scene. At the end of that day, almost 24 hours after the first confrontation, two of the leaders of the Whigs just went up and knocked on the door and went in and basically said, "Well, how about it? We think you'd better surrender." And they did. The court party did surrender. And so no further violence happened, and which is, I think, one of the things that is remarkable and that doesn't, I think that they deserve a great deal of credit for damping down the violence. One of the things that did happen, there were many threats of violence, and the Walpole militia under Colonel Bellows had come over with a lot of men, and they guarded the courthouse against their fellow Whigs. Bellows was a committed Whig, but he was a kind of a large gentleman, and he was not going to stand for that kind of violence. So the Walpole militia prevented that from happening, and they all surrendered. They were thrown in the cells. The court officials were thrown in the cells. All the county officials except the coroner actually either fled or were thrown in the cells. And that day just ended New York government here on this side of what's now Vermont. And it was never restored. Essentially, it ended British government as well. And remember, this is a month before Lexington and Concord. It was there was uproar for quite a while afterward. The Green Mountain Boys, a contingency of them arrived, but it was after all the main action. So that is the basics of the Westminster Massacre. And I should say it's kind of the fashion to snicker at it as that word, the massacre. Like, oh, well, how many people were killed? And it was two people. It was French, who died overnight on the floor of the jail cell. and Daniel Houghton from Putney, who was wounded and had been expected to survive, but he died 9 days later. So 2 people. But they called it a massacre at the time, and I'm sure they were harking back to the Boston Massacre. But just also when you imagine being there and imagine, I mean, I think of Kent State, plenty of us were alive for Kent State. You imagine nobody expected they were going to die that day. Nobody expected, they were promised that there wouldn't be violence that day. And that it was violence of the government against its own unarmed citizens. And I don't think that name is unwarranted. And it was like within a day or two, that's what they were calling it. So how do I come into this? What did I learn from? So I did grow up in Westminster, but I'm not one of the old families here. My maternal grandmother was in Atherton from Wilmington, and that family's been here since the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and has some connections, I believe, with some of the Westminster families. There's a Atherton Chafee, who was a member of the militia. There's Atherton Hall, who is the person who built the house from which I'm speaking. So I grew up on this farm, and at the time it was in 1775, it was owned by John Wells, who was a member of Azariah Wright's militia. But that wasn't something that I knew until I started working on this history. My parents were very interested in history. My dad, they were both in the local reenactors unit. My dad is here behind me in the chair. This picture of my dad in one of the reenactments of the massacre that we held. And my father was extremely interested in the revolution. So this house is just full of his books about it. I was always interested in history, and because I love stories. I'm a writer mostly of fiction, but I love history because of stories of people's lives and what happened and why and what happened next. I also grew to love history because my mother made me, I read all the horse books in all the libraries about 6 times, and she said, you have to branch out. So I looked at, I got historical novels that had horses on the covers and read those. So literally that's how it started. And I'm very proud that both of my Westminster history books have horses on the covers. That was like, I really wanted to make that happen. But then the Historical Society about 12 or so years ago asked me to write a new town history. And I came to it with pretty fresh eyes. I wasn't, I had kind of stayed out of their lane. They did all this revolutionary stuff. Excuse me. And I did not follow it closely. But the thing about the massacre in particular is that it is incredibly well documented. And it, I kind of started out writing my history by looking at things that have been done before, like the double history of Westminster, which is it's double because they did Abby Hemingway's Vermont Gazetteer. It's the story of the East Parish and the West Parish, and those were 1867, and they're full of nuggets, but it's a little hard to use. But the main source for this period, or the main way I got started on understanding this period, was Benjamin Hall's History of Eastern Vermont, which is just an amazing book. And my dad had a copy it's like an 800-page book. And I just was rereading Hall's introduction, and he was talking about how he'd imagined he would write a small book about this corner of Vermont and its history, and 800 pages later. And my dad had original copy that he paid $300 for in 1995, which I'm just using to this day. And what I didn't realize starting out is that Benjamin Hall was actually a grandson of Westminster. He was the grandson of Lot Hall, who came here to practice law right after the Revolution. And Lot Hall had a career straight out of a Patrick O'Brian novel. And then, so Benjamin Hall, the historian's father, actually went to school in the old courthouse before they tore it down. And Benjamin, the historian, lived in Westminster while he was writing this book. And it's kind of an interesting coincidence that this farmhouse where I'm speaking of, where I grew up, was built by Atherton Hall, who was Lot's cousin. So kind of a fun connection there. And one of the cool things about Hall's history, the best stories are in the footnotes. It is available now in a Google, electronically. You can look at it in a Google document, and also a facsimile edition has been printed. And it's really a pleasurable read and fun. And it's almost, it's pretty reliable that just kind of skip around, find a page with a footnote and start reading footnotes, and you're going to find a lot of fun stories. So, for instance, he interviewed, he was living in Westminster. He was not so far away from the time of the massacre, but what he could interview a few people who were eyewitnesses to some of what happened. So there's this really cool account from Calvin Webb, who was the son of Joshua Webb, who was a very important person in the early Vermont history. And so so here's Calvin's account of what happened the next day. At the time of the courthouse affray, I lived in Westminster, but was not present at the scene. Heard of it the next day from a little man, familiarly known as Hushen Walker, a mighty flax dresser, who was in the engagement. Soon after this, I started off in company with several other youngsters whose name I have forgotten. Many people were going in the same direction. It was about the middle of the day when I reached the courthouse, and soon after my arrival, I saw the body of French, who had been shot the night before. A sentry was stationed to guard the corpse as it lay on the jail room floor. The clothes were still upon it, as in life. The wounds seemed to be mostly about the head. The mouth was bloody, and the lips were swollen and blubbered. And then he goes on to talk about how people were pressing their handkerchiefs into the blood and or taking a lock of his hair. And I don't know, it would imply that somewhere at some time there were in a lot of houses, there must have been a handkerchief that had French's blood on it. And I've never heard of anybody ever, at some point it's just a gross old handkerchief and it gets thrown away. But the interesting thing so Calvin Webb was, 17 and told Benjamin Hall this story in the winter of 1852 when he was 95 years old. But according to Hall, he was unimpaired and remembered it all very vividly. There's also, he was in touch with one of Azariah Wright's sons, Salmon Wright, who was 12 or 13, and at the time of the massacre, and dictated this letter to Hall about the issue of whether the Whigs were armed. And he said, this is in the footnotes, in regard to the statements in the Tory depositions, Father says they are all fudge, that there were no weapons carried or used by the Liberty men except the aforementioned clubs. This is a fixed fact. And, I feel like, I'll talk about this in a minute, but what I love about Hall in this case is that you get the the flavor of the voices, and you get people who were alive at the time saying things like, Theophilus Crawford, who was a little boy at the time, saying the Whigs had not so much as a pistol among them. And then Calvin Webb, who we just heard, saying the Liberty men had no guns when they first came, but after French was killed, they went home and got them. So if you know anything about the massacre, like if you went and looked it up online before you came to this talk, you would learn a lot of really erroneous stuff about it. And I feel like I don't understand how that's possible. And I'm not saying, well, everybody should have read my book and should know better, but I don't understand why everybody hasn't read Benjamin Hall and know better, because he's meticulous in documenting where he learns things. He talked to people who were very close to participants. It's extremely well indexed. It's got both and this, for people who are interested in genealogy, it has two separate indexes, one for general topics and one for people. So you can, if somebody's in there, you have a really good chance of finding them. And so he's good. And my other great resource was my father, here on the chair behind me. As I was looking at, Hall made really copious use of documents lodged in Albany in the New York records. And I was trying to figure, do I need to go to Albany? There were certain ones that I wanted to get hold of. And I would, time and again, I'd mention to my father, like, how do I get hold of this, do you think? And this was, this book came out in 2011. Nowadays, I think much more of what I might be looking for is digitally available. But my father, I would say, I'd love to get hold of this thing. And my dad would say, well, I think I have a copy of that somewhere. So, for instance, this is in a Ziploc bag, is his copy without a cover of controversy between New York and New Hampshire. Now, the massacre is not part of that controversy, but in here are the depositions of the couriers who were sent to New York City to spread the word after the massacre. So, as this is a reader's copy. My dad was just an amazing pack rat for that kind of thing. And I'd ask a question about some person. Well, I'm pretty sure I have something like that in a folder, and he could always find them. And so that was a huge help to me. And I feel like I don't deserve a lot of credit for the research, in the sense that he had gathered most of it just as an amateur historian, in the same way that he and a couple of his friends as amateur mappers and geologists have mapped Westminster, the archaeological sites of Westminster, just kind of going out and doing it. Should also say Brooks Library. I don't know if his history room is as full as it was in the time that I was doing it. I know it's been downsized a little bit, but Brooks was a great resource for finding the documents for the state of Vermont. Let me see, I had more to say. I think I'll put the documents, the sources in the comments, and let me just show you the book that I ended up needing to write 2 books about the history of Westminster, just because there was so much to say about the massacre. And so we spun one out to do Revolutionary Westminster, so that centers on the massacre, but a lot of other revolutionary events happened in Westminster as well. And it was the center of the cow wars, where we had many prisoners again in the Westminster cells in the heat of June, and Ethan Allen made a famous appearance and said his famous thing about, speaking of Stephen Roe Bradley, I'll have the young gentleman know that I can upset his black stones and his brimstone. I don't know, he had a famous little speech that he made in Westminster. One of the particularly good random chance things that happened for me, I should say I was funded for this history and was able to take my time with it through a generous grant from the Dascom Trust, and that's a fund left by lumberman George Dascom, who I just learned in completing some historical notes for a novel I'm writing about the massacre, that George B. Dascom, whose trust continues to this day and whose descendants continue to live in Westminster, is a descendant of members of Azariah Wright's militia. And he's also, I believe, a descendant of John Norton, who was the owner of the Tory taverns. So it comes down, both sides of the conflict come down to people who are still present in Westminster today, and which I thought was really cool. So I always want to be sure to mention the Historical Society, the great a source that I have access to there was a little less relevant for the massacre, but an unpublished document on the life of Fanny Allen and her mother. And the serendipity of, among the resources we have are, the old time scrapbooks that people used to keep of newspaper clippings that related to Westminster. So one of them was a story that was printed. It was a reprint of a story that was printed in the Vermont Phoenix, and the Brattleboro Phoenix, I should say. That was the Vermont Phoenix. It was published in Brattleboro on March 22nd of 1805. And this was a story told to the paper by Fanny Allen. Fanny was the stepdaughter of Crean Brush, who was the arch Tory, the most hated Tory in Vermont at the time. And Crean Brush is the person who got the Cumberland County Court moved to Westminster, got the courthouse built, got himself elected to the New York Assembly. And he was in the New York Assembly at the time of the massacre. But according to what Fanny told the newspaper, she and her stepmother were here in Westminster. And so this is what the newspaper story said. Mrs. Brush, who had been a widow Montezan, and that's not true, but that's what she told the paper, told them that if the judges were not women in men's clothing, they would give the order to drive the rebels out of the courthouse at once and bring the leaders to trial for treason, that they had authority and arms and had only to contend with traitors who would run at the sound of their own voices. Her daughter, Frances Montezan, told her that she thought they had a just cause and to remember that there were Green Mountain boys on the other side of the mountains and that Ethan Allen would come to assist them. And I have to say, I doubted that story when I first read it. It seemed like why wouldn't they have been in New York with Crean Brush? And I have come to believe that was not the pattern that people followed in that time. And it's, all the way through Jane Austen novels and Trollope novels and you know, any historical things that I've read, the pattern was the man went to wherever the assembly was and lived in lodgings, and the women stayed home and took care of the household. So I've come to believe that it was true, and the picture that it paints of Mrs. Brush egging them on and Fanny trying to tamp them down. I wonder if that part is possibly a gloss on history, because she was, at the time that she told that story, the paper, she had been married to Ethan Allen and widowed and was then married to someone else. But, you know, on the other hand, that's what she said. And why should we doubt her? The other piece of evidence that convinces me that they were there is that one of the couriers who went to New York mentions having been at the Brush house on the day after the massacre. It's interesting, and as I'm writing the novel about this, so Westminster at this time was a town full of it was families. It was middle-aged couples with young kids for the most part. And so, you know, half the people in Westminster were female. And Fanny, what Fanny and her mother said, or what Fanny says they said to the sheriff, are the only lines, the only action that of women, of any woman in the whole story. It's a real guy's story, and except for those lines. I think I can just post the sources in the chat, and I'm going to do that in a second. So there are a couple of controversies about the massacre that I think the two major controversies: why did it happen? And everything that, you know, that I talked with you about early on gives it its revolutionary pedigree, that it was about the American Revolution. It was about the oppression in Massachusetts, the reaction to that oppression. And how do we know that? Because they said so. That was what, 10 days later after the massacre, the Whigs met and wrote up their report essentially of what had gone on. And they went back in time and traced, you know, these are our reasons. And remember, this is before Lexington and Concord, before there's an American Revolutionary War. Nobody knows what's going to happen next. But they're saying, hey, this happened, this is why. And our reasons were that, you know, the people did not feel well represented. They did not feel that the county officials were fit to have rule over them, and they wanted to make their statement. They say this, and actually Governor Colden of the lieutenant governor and acting governor of New York at the time says exactly the same thing in his letter to Lord Dartmouth on April 5th. Again, this is before Lexington and Concord. And he, at the end of this letter, he speaks of a number of people in Cumberland, worked up by the example and influence of Massachusetts Bay, embraced the dangerous revolution of shutting up the courts of justice. And then he, at the end of the letter, he says, "It is proper your lordship should be informed that the inhabitants of Cumberland County have not been made uneasy by any dispute about the titles of their land. Those who have not obtained grants under the government live in quiet possession under the grants formerly made by New Hampshire. The rioters have not pretended any such pretext for their conduct. The example of Massachusetts Bay is the only reason they assigned. Yet I make no doubt they will be joined by the Bennington rioters, who will endeavor to make one common cause of it, though they have not connection but their violence to government." So unfortunately, from my point of view, what has happened in the modern day understanding of the massacre is is an understandable impulse to try and come up with a shortcut, because this is a complicated event. It's hard to speak of in under 45 minutes. So as Governor Colden predicted in 1775, it has been tied together with Ethan Allen's dispute on the other side of the state. The whole, even the memory of the Massachusetts Farmers Rebellion is really very dim. I didn't know about it until I chanced upon a book by Ray Raphael talking about a kind of bottom-up view of it was a people's history of the revolution, of kind of, not just the leadership we've all heard about, but what was happening out in the countryside, what were the people doing. And, here, as someone who grew up interested in history, this was something that I just was not aware of. Possibly if I'd been a thorough student of the revolution, I would have known about it. But when the Westminster Massacre is talked about by Vermont historians, you won't hear a word about what was happening literally next door. You know how far away Massachusetts is. Everybody, almost to a person, the settlers in Westminster were from Massachusetts, and they were extremely well connected politically. I mean, we know, for instance, that people here found out about Lexington and Concord 2 days later. So it's not, there's not the internet or a telephone, but people found out about stuff really quickly. And yet no account, and like even Hall doesn't talk about what was going on following the exact same pattern in Massachusetts. So I feel like, as someone that I was looking at primary documents that had been printed in books centuries ago, literally. And yet I think bringing fresh eyes, seeing something that not everybody was seeing, and being willing to tell the story in long form again, rather than try to tell it in short form. And some of the short forms are really uninformed, like that somehow it was in the New York, New Hampshire dispute, or it was all about people worried that their farms are being foreclosed on. So in Massachusetts, where the Farmers' Rebellion happened, was all over. Like every single town that had a court in it had one of these extremely large demonstrations, and the courts were closed. One of the difference here, I believe, why it failed here and why there was violence here, is that the numbers were so much smaller. The population was so much smaller that for a large demonstration here was 100 people. And the sheriff had nearly that many in his posse. And it's like, unlike, okay, there's 6,000 farmers with sticks in the streets. Yeah, we're going to do just what they say. This was like, we can, especially after 4 gallons of rum, you're like, we can take them. So a kind of drunken macho scene ensued that was just unthinkable when you had that many people in a Massachusetts town in the streets. And then the other big controversy is, were both sides armed? And the Whigs have, to a person, said no. The Tories, even from, they wrote their account of it the next morning after they spent the night tormenting French and drinking in the courthouse, and the next morning woke up extremely hungover, and they're like, somebody's gonna tell this wrong, we gotta write it down. And so they met. It was the last official act of the court was to write up their account, in which they immediately said, oh yeah, they were armed. And is it a simple, which side do you believe? We have the pattern of Massachusetts that these were unarmed protests. We know that it was very illegal to have any protest, but it was much more illegal to have an armed protest. And I have always thought, well, given what happened, that if anybody had snuck a pistol in there, for instance, that they would have said so afterwards, like kind of like, yeah, I told you this was going to go badly. See, and I was the only one who was smart. There's never, not a single person refers to anybody being armed. So in my opinion, there's just I believe that they were not armed. And it's part of, I think, an unfortunate both sides-ism way of looking at the massacre is like, well, it's a long time ago. We can't know. And it, I probably better be quiet about that. Just because some of it seems like poor historical practice to me, that not taking people at their word and not looking at who has a reason to say what, who's got a dog in the fight, and whose interest is served by saying what. The other thing, writing a novel about the massacre, as I've been doing the last couple of years, it's a different way of looking at it, where you're really trying to put yourself there, trying to be there and see what a person there would see. And at some point quite recently, I realized if those guys had weapons, if the Whigs had weapons, everybody in the village would have known about it. And this is another example of, well, where the women and children were invisible, there's no mention of spectators at all in the story. But this was a village, and nobody expected this to be violent. And I can't imagine that everybody, on a dull March day in a Vermont village, everybody wasn't out watching, or at least watching through the windows. And you cannot hide, you're not going to hide a musket as you're walking up the hill. People would have known, people would have seen if they had weapons. And, there's no hint of it. So clearly I do take sides in this story. But I also, it's interesting to me, one of the things, just as a Westminster historian, and I'll close with this, there were no Westminster people that I know of injured in the massacre, in the actual fight, because they'd gone home. The Westminster people who took a prominent role in the fight were the Willards, who bragged that they themselves had shot William French. And so Westminster, we kind of claim William French, and I'm sure many people think he may have been from Westminster. He was a guy who lived on the Dummerston-Brattleboro line, and he's buried in Westminster. Daniel Houghton was from Putney, and the killers were from Westminster. So, it's a complicated story. So let me just mention a couple of events. We will be commemorating the 250th anniversary of the massacre. With our plans are maturing, but we are going to have a candlelight vigil at French's memorial, I believe, on the 13th, and possibly an event on a Saturday, the following Saturday, with speakers, and have March 13th declared Westminster Massacre Day. And if I can share the screen for a minute here, Jerry, if you can let me just share screen for a second, I can show you a cover mock-up of my novel that's coming out right around that time. Dearest Blood. And this is this is about Fanny Allen at that time, Fanny Montesand, and the massacre is witnessed by her, and then her subsequent romance with Ethan Allen. So watch for that. And yeah, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. And
Wow, that was great. Really, really great history and narrative, and you did it so well. There are some questions in the chat. Let me pull them out for you. I think you answered this one. How many besides French died? What were the major write-ups?
Yeah, there was one.
That's early. Yeah, and you mentioned about the major write-ups. Then we have what might we know about the spread of the news among the colonies? Are there records, minutes, letters, etc.? I think you kind of took that on, but if there's more you want to talk about there.
Well, we know in Massachusetts, there were regular systems of couriers, mounted couriers, carrying news, and presumably that happened up here as well, because news seemed to travel really fast, especially around the events right before the massacre. And when you consider that it was March in Vermont with practically non-existent roads, it's hard to figure out how it was done, except people. There must have been some people really riding like hell up and down those tracks, because they got word. It's hard to believe how quickly they got it.
Chip Howard asks, is this the Fanny Allen, the same person who was involved in the Fanny Allen Hospital in Colchester, or the name?
It's her mother. It's her mother.
Mother, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, he says subsequent UVM Medical Center and was a nun.
Yes, she was a nun. She which was big news in those days, that she converted to Catholicism, especially as Ethan Allen's daughter, who was famously an agnostic or an atheist, and she converted to Catholicism. And there's a fun, like Joe Citro-esque story of how this happened, which happened in Westminster, that she was walking by the river and some kind of weird monster came up out of the river and terrified her. And she, was just paralyzed and couldn't move. And suddenly there was a man with a bearded man in a robe standing behind her and said, no, go, just walk away. It's all right. And kind of calmed things down, and she escaped. And later, when she had become interested in Catholicism, but she was in a chapel and saw a painting and of some saint, and it was exactly the man who had rescued her from the monster on the banks of the Connecticut River. So that was a big part of her conversion. But yeah, so Fanny, she witnessed the massacre. Then she and her mother joined Korean Brush in New York, and she was married off at the age of 15 to someone she'd never met, and was widowed pretty quickly, and returned to Westminster as a young widow, and met Ethan Allen had been recently widowed, and he visited Westminster frequently because his lawyer was here, one of his lawyers, Stephen Rowe Bradley, and also he was very good friends with John Norton at the Tory Tavern, and so that was one of his favorite drinking holes as well. And Norton and Fanny were good friends, so they knew each other there, and which is where she, and speaking of women's voices in history, so Fanny Allen was this very educated, intelligent, spirited woman in history, and there's like 3 things that she's ever even reputed to have said, or we don't have any writings from her. And so there's like 3 things that she ever said that we know about, and they happened in Westminster. So at one point, after she was courting, Ethan was courting her, and John Norton at the Tory Tavern said, well, you know, Fanny, if you marry Ethan Allen, you'll be the queen of a new state. And she said, and if I marry the devil, I'll be the queen of hell. And she had a pretty sharp tongue on her. And then, of course, Fanny and her mother were living at Stephen Rowe Bradley's house, and she was famously standing on a chair putting something away in a cupboard when he came in, and you know, whether this was by prior arrangement or this was his proposal, we don't know, but he said, he came in and said, well, if we're to be married, we'd better get going because I have to get over the hill. And she said, very well, but let me go put on my Joseph, and step down off the chair. And those are that and what she and her mother said to the sheriff are the three things that we have even any inkling that she may have said. So her Westminster connection is pretty cool.
And there's another question here. Could you just repeat where in Massachusetts the Farmers' Rebellion happened?
Essentially everywhere. It was the towns that had courts. So if you look at, and I don't know if the modern counties are exactly the same as the counties were then, but Worcester, there was a court there, and there was a really large demonstration there. Northampton, I believe there was one at Northfield, one at Taunton, and basically, you know, all across the countryside. Boston was under British occupation then, and many of those people were just terrified, and, you know, they were consciously, you know, had the fear of God put in them by these protesters. A lot of the focus was on the courthouses, but a lot of times they just came to these guys' houses, like 2,000 or 3,000 men standing outside with sticks and making threats and saying things, and very very understandably, these guys just took off for Boston. And in fact, one of these incidents was the trigger for what's called the powder scare, or where one of the court officials raced off to Boston, and people chased him, and he kind of, you know, he got behind the lines there, but somehow the rumor spread from this that the British had shelled Boston, and then the farther it got, it was like the game of telephone. The farther it got from Boston, the wilder the rumors became that Boston had been destroyed by the British. And, you know, and this is a case of how, if you read about that, you can see how quickly news spread across the countryside. And it was the sort of classic Minuteman moment where people just stopped whatever they were doing. The women ran shot out in the yard in their jelly, they're in their kettles, and made food, and everybody, the Minutemen just marched on Boston. The estimate of 100,000 heavily armed men marching on Boston, and there weren't very many British troops in Boston. And then they stopped when they finally figured out, oh, Boston's still there. That didn't really happen. But they didn't like slink home in great embarrassment. It was this amazing demonstration of, what this highly populous colony, what the sentiment was. And I just imagine Gage in Boston just going, holy shit. What just happened? It didn't happen, but oh my God.
Did we say something that?
yeah. It was a very emboldening to the Continental Congress that was meeting at the time. And they were, they also got word of this and were waiting for news of how is this going to come out. And the fact that the whole of Massachusetts essentially rose up in rebellion spontaneously without leadership, really. It was just like, I'm going, they can't do this. We're going. It was like, oh, we can probably do this. I think people got this impression. So, so the
Well,
Westminster Massacre is part of this whole movement. It didn't stop
yeah,
at
that's
the
right.
border.
It's a thread. Wow, that's great. What great historical research and uh, giving hints for everyone here how to conduct it through stories and so forth. So, and when is the book expected? The new book?
I am hoping to bring it out just before the
Before
13th.
the
Yeah.
Okay, well, great. We all been looking for that for sure. And well, thank you so much. I mean, you put in a lot of energy. You can tell it's a passion of yours.
Yeah, it was my dad's, and I have to say the
Yeah,
more I've learned about it, the more fascinating it's
yeah.
become.
Well,
It's not
really,
always true about your parents' passions, as I'm sure we
yeah,
all
that's right. That's
we
right.
all
But you really filled in the gaps in my in my knowledge about it. That's for sure. So okay, well, that's great. And you can put stuff in the chat, and then also send it to me in a document, and I'll put it in our folders online so people can access it later.
right. Yes, I have the
Any
chat up, but
yeah,
I'm not seeing how to add
uh,
something to it.
yeah.
So, all right.
But yeah.
All right, there it goes.
Okay, good. Great. Okay, so we'll proceed with the rest of the program. And Wayne, you ready
Okay.
to take the stage?
Yeah,
Gonna be a
I
hard
don't
act
have
to follow,
I don't have
but you're
quite the
up to
great
it.
story. I don't have quite the great story there. Thank you, Jesse, for doing all that. Um, nor do I have the memory. So most of my stuff is I have written down. Let me just start by sharing the screen. Get this started this way. So I this is my own research. But what I've tried to do is incorporate some of the things I just learned from. I just recently took a 5-week course from the New England Historical and Genealogical Society, and so it's about a family that I've been having a lot of trouble finding any information on. So here's the problem. I was trying to figure out this Francis Alonzo Fisher and who his mother was and when he was born. So that's my basic question. There's a history of Monroe, New Hampshire that talks about him, or just a line about him, really. That he was born in Woodbury, Vermont on the 19th of March, 1835. That he married her name in all the records is Nancy, but she clearly went by her middle name, Lucetta or Lucy, of Walden, Vermont. He was a farmer, a cooper, and they lived on a farm on the road that goes from Monroe to North Monroe. So that was the basic information I had about him, and I originally just sort of accepted that. I keep a record in a genealogy software, and so I just wrote that down. But as I looked in it a little further, I thought, well, for sure I could find a birth record, but there's no birth record of his birth in Woodbury, Vermont. The Monroe history lists his parents as George Fisher and Mary Cole. And just a little bit of information about them. George Washington Fisher, born in Hardwick, 1806, died in Monroe in 1882, married to Mary Cole. Now, it did say she was born in 1826 and died in Monroe in 1886. And they're both buried in North Monroe Cemetery. And then the history does say that they came from Hardwick, Vermont. So, I mean, originally I paid not much attention to the dates. I mean, it was pretty sloppy on my part, actually. Because if Mary was born in 1826 and Frank was born in 1835, how could that be? Just not possible. So in the course I took, they gave these suggestions about places, birth record substitutes. So I started going through the list and comparing it to what I had. So I didn't have any church records or a baptism record for him. I have never seen any family registers or a family Bible that records any of those dates. So the next possibility is U.S. Census records. So the 1900 census does list a birth month and year of a person. So that was one thing for me to look at. Gravestones, giving the birth date or age at death. So another thing that I could look at. Newspapers, I have not had much luck finding birth announcements. They said in the course that it started in the 19th century, but I think it was much later in the 19th century than I was looking at, because in newspapers you can find some marriage announcements and death announcements, but not rarely birth announcements, at least in my experience. Naturalization records were out for me because the family had been in the country. Well, I don't know how long, because that's still another one of the problems. But before naturalization records were really being kept, and the same with passports. Military pension records I have used for other people, and they are certainly very valuable if the person had served. We're talking here, early 1800s, so not a lot of possibility for pension records. And other records, they suggested adoption records, school records, employment records, Social Security applications, passenger lists. Really, none of those apply in the situation that I'm looking at either. Basically too early, really, for any of those records to exist, or still exist anyway. So anyway, so here's part of what I have been able to find. So this is a Civil War draft register. It does show Francis Fisher. He says he's 32, working as a cooper, and that he's married and was born in Vermont. So anyway, that would put his birth year as 1831. So that gives me another possibility. The 1860 census is useful. It shows Frank Fisher and his wife Lucetta here, although in the 1850 they didn't tell you that information. But from other records, I know there are a couple. Just says he's working as a farm laborer. Again, it kind of confirms that he was born in Vermont. This would put his birth date about 1830. In the 1880 census, unfortunately, she has already died. He's a widower living in Monroe, still working as a cooper. Still shows that he was born in Vermont, and puts his age here, puts him, and again, about 1830. The really confusing thing about this part is this last child is only 3 months old. But I can't figure out where Bertie came from. Because Frank is a widower with no second wife. according to her gravestone, Lucetta died in 1878, and this census was taken in June of 1880. So again, the family itself, trying to piece it all together, has been a real challenge for me. So that's just another problem. So 1900 census. This one does have a lot of information. He's living on a farm. It's a little hard to tell. He's listed as the head of a household here, but right next door, or perhaps it's the same household. I'm really not sure about that. I mean, they're listed separately, but this is his daughter and her husband living next door. It says he is 66, and it lists his birth date in March of 1834. Now, it can be a little iffy, I'm assuming that he is the one that actually provided the information. I would think this is probably one of the more accurate birth dates, but I mean, it's possible the information came from his daughter, because she's right there next door. So we really don't know for sure, but if he provided it, that seems to be one of the more reliable dates, I think. This is what Monroe has for a death certificate, which is where all the information came from, I assume, from in the history book, because this says that his date of birth is March 19th, 1835, that he died September 11th, 1912. It does list his father as being George Fisher and his mother as Miss Cole. But as I already said, she probably, I mean, there's no way she can be his mother. She's probably the mother that raised him, but not his birth mother. So expanding the search, the idea here is to look for other family and see if there's somehow the connections can be made using other records. So cemetery records, census records, church records, city directories, local histories. Local history was my starting point. Land records, again, naturalization records, newspaper articles, particularly obituaries, are particularly useful. Probate records, hopefully finding a will that would list heirs or the administrators of the will. Frequently are going to be relatives. And other town records, individuals of family who may have arrived in the same area might also appear in some form of town records, but particularly like records of taxes that were paid. So there's a lot of other places to look for records, something to verify what the information you're looking for. So I could identify other people in the family. So I didn't find a marriage record for Frank Fisher and Nancy Lucetta Cole. However, there are records for the births of their children, and a lot of times those records do list the parents as well. The birth records, we would hope they list the parents. I meant also that marriage records frequently also has information about the parents. So here's a daughter. So it does list Lucetta as the mother and Frank Fisher as the father. It does not. It lists her birthplace. Lucetta's birthplace is Windham. Unfortunately, it doesn't say anything about Frank's birthplace, which is what I was trying to narrow, what I start with here, trying to narrow that down. So anyway, that's what I mean by finding other records that might give you hints about the information you're looking for. So here in the record of their son, Austin, again, they were married in Monroe. This says that Frank was born in Hardwick, Vermont, which also appeared in the town history that they moved to, that his parents moved to Monroe from Hardwick. So anyway, it's a clue that I wanted to check, see if I could find anything in Hardwick records. The fact that he was born in Monroe in 1867 also helps to show that when they made a move from Vermont into New Hampshire. Here's another son. This time it does show that Frank was born in Woodbury, Lucetta was born in Walden. Her birthplace is pretty consistent in most of the records I found, that she was born in Walden. By the way, this was a pretty gruesome death. He was killed by an explosion in a boiler explosion. And the newspaper articles of the time were pretty graphic. I mean, they gave a lot of details about what the situation looked like. Just as a warning, if you look into some old papers. So they didn't hold back in those days. Here's another daughter. Her marriage shows that this time it says Frank was born in Walden, and there was no information on Lucetta. Cora would have been fairly young when her mother died, so I suspect that may be part of it too. She just may not have had may not have remembered or not really even known the information, basically because of her, her age at that point. I mean, at the point that her mother died. So anyway, the point with all this is just that these other records can give you hints. In this case, again, what I'm looking for is the birthplace of Frank Fisher, and these other records just give you hints about where to look. This another birth. Unfortunately, she died the same day. But again, it consistently shows that Lucetta was born in Walden, and this again says Frank was born in Woodbury. So knowing that, or presuming that Mary could not be his mother, I was searching for other records and found this one, that his father George, a marriage record from Littleton, New Hampshire, that they were married, that he was married to an Emily Barrett on the 10th of March in 1829. So anyway, again, I'm guessing that she was probably the birth mother of Frank. I did find a record of a William Fisher that he was born in. This is in his death record. It says he was born in Woodbury. Confirms that he's a son of George and Emily. The timing seems good. That in 1832, it's just a couple years after his parents' marriage. So anyway, it's the only record the only vital record that I found of him, though. Did not find a birth record for him either. So, again, turning to census records. This time I'm going back a generation, looking at his father. So in 1850, we have George and Mary living in Lyman, New Hampshire. I also have not found a marriage record for them. Like I said, this is a particularly challenging family that you think some of these records should still exist, but if they do, I've not found them yet. But there are records for some of these other children, Emmeline, George, and Hiram, that show that they were a couple. So I have other. I don't have proof of the marriage, but I have indications that they were a couple. The other thing that kind of sticks out here is that William is in that household. He's 19. So he had to have been from the first marriage between George and Emily. Frank is not in the household. The thing that really struck me, though, is the couple that's living right next door. I'm wondering if these are George's parents. In other words, this would be Frank's grandparents. And Edward Fisher. Well, Edward, a lot of other references I found. His name was Edmund, and this is Rebecca. They're listed as paupers, so another, which actually is kind of a disadvantage, because if they had, they really would. If they're just paupers, they had no estate. So it's hard to tell if the living is part of the same household, but it was the census taker separated them out, or whether they are somehow living in a place next door. I mean, the census implies that they're living next door, but it's hard, it's hard to tell. Hard to find any records on them either. So I did find Frank, but he's living in Concord, Vermont, with this Bingham family. So again, another one of the suggestions that I had in the course is to research the other people that are associated, with the person you're trying to find out about. I have not got that far with this in terms of finding out about this Bingham family, if they're somehow a relative. Next door, right next door down here, though, is a person with last name is Barker. And there is a Barker. I have not found the connection yet, but next door there's Ezra Barker, and Frank's stepmother, his stepmother's mother, if you could follow that, was an Anna Barker. And she's also she's the mother of his future wife. So again, I have not been able to find a whole lot about this Barker family, but again, that would probably be a way to pursue this further, would be to find out who else is in the Barker family and if this is a relative also. And that's how Francis came to be working next door with this Bingham family. It's complicated, and you have to really want to find out about a family if you're going to go to this extent to research all the, allied families this way. Marriage records, again, I did not find marriage records on these folks, but the same kind of thing applies. If you can find church records, there are probably recordings of marriage intentions and so forth in the church records. Census records do, in 1900, 1910, shows the number of years they were married, and the 1930 reports the age at first marriage. So again, another place to look for hints. Newspapers, I have had some luck finding marriages, even in early newspapers, listing of just listing that they got married. Usually not a lot for details, but just that, that they did get married. Divorce records can also include the date of marriage. I have had some luck with some research that I've done in finding even relatively early. One family, it was early 1860s, I think, I found a divorce record that listed when they got married. Pension records are also excellent. This would be for Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Civil War, particularly if you find a widow's pension, because her application needed some kind of documentation, that proof that they were actually married. And again, family registers of Bibles, if you find those, would be good sources. So lacking a lot of those, gravestones, and to some degree, if the cemetery, well, especially if it's a recent cemetery, an active cemetery, the town or, well, usually it would be a town or public record. They would keep records of who's buried in the cemetery. Even if a gravestone doesn't exist, there might be cemetery records. In this case, they have a gravestone verifying that Mary Fisher was the wife of George Fisher. I wish I'd been able to find the same thing about his first wife, Emily, but I have not found any gravestone for her. And this is Frank's wife. Again, I don't have a marriage record, but it does indicate right on the gravestone that she was the wife of Francis Fisher. Same kind of thing happens in terms of death record substitutes. There might be church records, something about the funeral or the burial. Gravestone, as we just seen. The family Bible. Death notices do appear, and especially helpful if there's actually an obituary. In a small town newspaper, it's more likely to find that. The bigger city papers might list people who died, but rarely had an obituary unless the person was famous for something. This is kind of an odd one, but the U.S. Census does have mortality schedules for the years 1850 to 1880. The death had to occur in the calendar year prior to the date of the census. So if the census was taken in, say, June, it would go back to probably the May of the previous year. So in 1850, if somebody died in, say, if the census was taken, say, in June of 1850, it would be people who died between May of 1849 and June of 1850. So that's a possibility to find stuff. I have not tried to do this, but coroner's reports, the results might be printed in the paper. Hospital records, I again had, I have not found any of these, but I don't think hospitals keep records for they may have a set time they have to keep them, but I don't think they keep them. And in my case, there probably weren't even hospitals in that part, in like Monroe, New Hampshire, for example. Final pension payments, again, the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War. You probably can find those kinds of records. I have not tried to find funeral home records. Partly because the people I'm researching are far enough back in time that those records probably, well, they probably were not funeral homes. I'm not sure when they actually started, but the records, you would need to know what funeral home was involved. Newspapers, I've had a little more luck with. I couldn't find a death certificate, but this St. Johnsbury Caledonian reported her death as it was printed. This was printed in the 20th of December, 1878, and it does confirm that she died on December 17th, which was also the date on that gravestone, which, getting back to my earlier thing, means I don't know where Bertie came from, but he was not her son. So that still is a mystery. I also was looking for things, more newspaper clippings about Frank. I found several talking about his poor health. This one happened to be published on September 11th, which was the day he died, but all it says was that he remains very low and that his son had come to help care for him. I tried to find, in the Caledonian, I tried to find some other mention of his death, but there didn't seem to be any follow-up. There was nothing in the papers, in like the month afterwards. They still found nothing. I had better luck with this Littleton Courier, which I was kind of actually very pleased to find. So this gives me evidence for sure that Frank was not the child of Mary Cole, because it refers, in this case, to two half-sisters. And so Lydia Fisher I found records on her that she confirms that she was the daughter of George Fisher and Mary Cole, and that she was married to this George Welch. And Bertha Fisher, again, was also a daughter of George and Mary, and that she was married to Milo Bean. So even though it only gave them as Mrs. George Welch and Mrs. Milo Bean, I was able to verify that. So because it lists them as half-sisters. Now, this also says that he was 81. The death record says he was 77. So again, another discrepancy. And it's hard to sort through. And in other words, I don't trust the date that he was 81 years old, but it does seem pretty convincing because he was able to name, I could verify that he had these daughters, the Mrs. Henry Jellison and the Mrs. Cora McNamara are daughters, and his son Austin is there. So it leads me to believe, that the rest of this is accurate. I could find more about these people, his half sisters. Well, here's Lydia Fisher. She's listed as Mrs. Welch, but the death certificate here does also show that, that she's the daughter of George Fisher and Mary Cole. It lists his birthplace now as Walcott, Vermont. So I got another place that I could look. She consistently is Walden. So for whatever reason, everybody remembered that she was born in Walden when they were providing information. So anyway, I've not got too far along with this. So I just wanted to summarize, and again, a recommendation, if you're going to do this kind of research, is to keep even better records than I have here, about what you've looked at, what you conclude from it, what the source is, how much you trust that source. So we can confirm we have a marriage record that George Fisher and Emily Barrett were married. I have a record of William Fisher, who would have to be his brother, of an Emmeline Fisher, a half-sister, which the importance of her is just that George Fisher and Mary Cole, the parents, had to have been married about the same, within a year or two of when she was born. So that was why her record is important. Which also means the first wife probably died about 1840. There, or slightly earlier than that. We do have a census record, and again, I was kind of leaning on that one because if he provided the information, that he was born in March of 1834, it doesn't give the day, but it does give the month and year. And we know for sure that he died on the 11th of September in 1912. So I mean, I have just some basic facts about him. Found a little bit more about the family. In terms of what to do next, I want to follow up with this, see if I can find. In my mind, there still might be some other records that I haven't found yet. So to check with the town clerks in Walden, Woodbury, and Hardwick. See if a probate record exists. I'd love to find a probate record on his father, because hopefully that would also list something about Frank himself. And then looking for records on land transactions. There is just for general information, I guess, New Hampshire deeds that are on this website, newhampshiredeeds.org. I'm not sure if they go back as far as that. I still haven't checked. I mean, I've tried using it and I haven't had a lot of luck yet, but I'm new to the website. Town records, I mean, land records in Vermont are by the town, not by the county. So I would need to look, again, that would be why I would look into some of these towns in Vermont that they have a connection to. And town records themselves might have information about the family. Tax records might verify that they, if they paid taxes in the town, obviously they lived there, which would lead me to maybe look for any land transactions, deeds. The other thing I was thinking about is this Edmund and Rebecca Fisher. They were listed as paupers and probably might have received help from the town. I have run across that in other town reports and so forth that listed what kind of support they were providing for people that could not provide for themselves. So anyway, more to be done with this family. And that's pretty much where I am on this quest.
Are you exhausted, Wayne?
You don't undertake this unless you're really interested in finding out about the family, to go to this extent. But he's annoying me because I can fill in a lot of this would be a great-great-grandparents. And I have found something about almost all the other ones, all the other great-great-grandparents. So this one has been bugging me.
There is a question for you from Cindy Bell. Do you use Family Search?
Using Family Search?
Do you use it?
Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, it's
Has to be-
probably the best for doing this kind of search. Well, for example, finding you can find land records by what was I? Oh, Hardwick. No, wait a minute. Woodbury. I tried to find them in the Woodbury records, and I could find some Fishers, but not the right ones from that time period, from the 1800s. So I mean, Family Search is probably the main place to search if you wanted to look for those kinds of records.
And it's free.
And it's free. Not easy searching, the land records that I was searching for, it's not like you've got a search box and you can just type in their name and have it pop up. You're looking at digitized pictures of the actual ledgers from the town, which I discovered they did have indexes in front of the front part of their ledgers, or in some cases they had a separate book that was just an index. It would tell you which volume and which pages to go to, to find a deed, for example, or the grantor and the grantee.
Right.
But
very complicated sometimes.
It's not. I suspect that'll be changing. I mean, that may be one of the benefits of artificial intelligence is that
right.
If they can just turn it loose on a whole set of records and come up with an index, a searchable index.
Right.
I mean, that happened in the when they released the 1950 census, the most recent census that's available. They used artificial intelligence to search through and create an index of those things. So it was almost instantly available. Not perfect, but it made it a lot simpler to find. So I suspect that'll continue to happen.
Yeah. Regarding keeping track of all this, what I've used in the past is like a spreadsheet. I don't know, did you do you use spreadsheets?
I have no. But that's the main recommendation that everybody has. So I don't know. You want to talk a little bit more about how you use them?
Well, I just try to collect all of these anomalous facts and put them in rows and columns so that you can say, oh, the 1900 census said he was 32, but the 1880 census said he was this, and that way you can try to correlate the discrepancies, and then you might see a trend somewhere. But just it just gives it to you in one place, so you can sort of compare facts. But
there are probably I don't know. Have you run there are probably some templates available.
Yeah, I think so.
Spreadsheets to do that kind of thing for genealogy.
Right. I think probably I download and maybe even American Ancestors might.
Yeah, American Ancestors.
Or even Family Search. They do they sometimes do.
Or Family Search, yeah.
Well, so yeah, definitely. I think that is it. So Chip Howard says yeoman's job. Congrats.
Wow, thanks.
But
it's a little frustrating not to actually. I wanted to have some major breakthrough, just find the thing that was going to put all the pieces in place.
I'll probably come when you least expect it.
It could be.
Any other questions or comments and anything? It's open now. We can just talk a little bit about your research. If you have any questions for us that we can struggle with.
Well, I found Wayne's presentation wonderful, and it gave me some ideas as
Oh,
to,
good.
how further ideas as to how to go after a few of those greats that I've not yet been able to, get all I want to know about them. And I think it's especially interesting looking for like associated family members and or people in the family that you're not really searching for, but they're on that same page on the census report. And I've found that fairly useful recently. I don't know. It was quite fine, Wayne. Thank you.
Yeah.
I am also especially interested in getting more organized, whether it's with a spreadsheet like you were talking about, Jerry, or some sort of a way to keep my findings organized, because I try to make citations and they're sort of endless and meaningless. And I don't know whether it should just be something to click on or what, but
Do you use genealogy software?
I do. I'm using, what is it?
Family
I've used Reunion,
Reunion?
and I don't know, I'm using going on Ancestry now, and as well as Family Search. Family Search, when I do pick up a citation, they seem pretty like it's easy to sort of grab it and paste it. But with Ancestry, it seems like they're, when you look at the what it came from, it's broken down in such a way that it's hard to know what part of it to, just
There's
keep. Yeah,
there's a guy on the web. His name is Randy Seaver, and
let me write it down.
like maybe I can find it real quick, put it in the chat. But he does boilerplate kind of examples of citations.
That would probably be very useful to me at this point.
Yeah, and which allows you to sort of, oh yeah, that's kind of way it should look like. This is the data.
Right.
Try to
Because I want to be able to, go to it again, or if I share the information with my sisters or my brother, I'd like them to be able to go to it rather than, have to figure out how to get there.
yeah, his blog is called Genie Musings.
Jeannie,
Yeah,
G-E.
let me share it real quick. I think I can show it to you then, and maybe even find this. So this is at Genie Use Musings.
Uh-huh. I just took a quick screenshot of it.
Here it is, sample source citations.
Oh, great.
And then so you have like vital records and certificates, marriages found on family history, microfilm. So that gives you kind of a idea. Death records, the U.S. Burls, that's the veterans database on Ancestry. So you could actually kind of copy and paste these and then just change them, to with your particular information. So it's a little helpful. There are
Right.
other sources too. I think I have a one from the yeah. Let's see. This is from the New England Historic Genealogy. This is one that I bought. It's called. Can you see that? I don't know if you see.
Reference notes.
Yeah,
Portable genealogist.
yeah, and it's sample citations too.
Okay.
It has basic guidelines, placement, citation styles, and then it has examples like Randy Seaver has. And this wasn't too much. It's what a laminated 2-4 page back and front. And you can, I'm sure you can order it from the store at New England American Ancestors.
Okay.
If you're using Reunion, there's a built-in thing there for sources.
I've tried to do that and I don't know, it gets confusing to me for some reason. I'm not sure
Hmm.
what part of it I should be pasting here and there.
Do a
So,
workshop on that sometime, or,
The well, well, there's a couple of suggestions I would have. Well, I mean, what I usually do is just make a copy, a screenshot of
right,
a document, and then attach it to a person in reunion using their. You click on the media
yeah,
button, but there's also a source button where you can but you have to type in the source information.
yes,
And
and
there's a variety of sources. I mean, there's one for books, there's one for vital records. I don't know if you've seen that. Then
I have,
you can then attach that to. You can attach the source. I mean, literally, kind of drag and drop the source, or to wherever you want. Like it's a source. If it's a source for a birth record,
yeah,
you fill it out, and then you just attach it to the person's birth. When you're typing in the birthday.
right. No, I've done a certain amount of that, but
Yeah.
I also think sometimes, if it's something from ancestry, it just seems like there's an awful lot of stuff, and I'd like to keep it fairly simple for myself or
Yeah.
for anyone else who might like to look at it. So something, I don't know. It would be interesting to do a quick thing on that one day, and I will look at Randy Seaver's thing and see if that gives me some clues.
Yeah.
But
Well,
but that
another suggestion, if you want to do it, a quick way to do it, if you're looking on Ancestry, there's always a link there to tell you what the source is for whatever you're looking at.
well, I
And you
look
can
at
just
those,
copy and paste that.
but it seems like an awful lot of stuff to copy to paste. It just seems like your citations could go on and on and on, and I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
just
yeah,
wondering how
I mean, they're
concise.
pretty.
You
I'm
want to
just
see the
wondering
Bible? This is the Bible on citations.
Evidence explained.
It's
Oh,
it's 800 pages.
oh my
I was going
word.
to say
I'm no
that one
older. I
is
want to do that.
that
It's
one goes into great depth.
yeah, very much. It's way into the weeds, and it's Elizabeth Schoen Mills is the author. She's
Uh-huh.
a one of the most known genealogists nowadays.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, it's
I don't think I think that's probably be I think I'll
but, I
check.
mean, but it'll come
Randy's
across
paper.
a record that you can't find anywhere else. They don't
Right.
know how to cite it. So and it goes into a lot of the online stuff too, where you might come across a record online and you're saying, well, how do I really cite this record so somebody else can find it later?
Exactly.
I can
Or I can find it later.
exactly.
Yeah, that's always good if you don't have to repeat it. If you can find your own notes.
Yes. Well, this was great. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Ken.
No,
Anybody
you
else have questions or comments? Otherwise, we can go have some lunch.
Yeah, we probably should do that.
So
Good idea.
We're always looking for ideas, though. If
definitely let us
anybody's
know.
got something we want to talk
Well-
about, or if somebody would like to do a presentation,
I think it would be interesting
where
also.
you have a couple months to get ready.
Yeah.
Well, if I figure out anything about citations, I'll be in touch. And
Okay.
it would be interesting also to look at in depth on a US Census record. I'm especially interested in the households that might be related that are close in the census report. And I see households in order of visitation, but sometimes I don't see streets. And I'm wondering if that kind of information is available. But anyway, census records would be kind of
Oh.
interesting to explore.
Yeah, varies with the census, but yeah.
It seems to.
I mean, that Fisher family that I was researching, I mean, I could find several family members that were only a couple of pages apart.
Yes.
in the census record. So they live fairly close by.
But there's no, I don't know, maybe the street's not important back in.
Well, the
then.
street's helpful, especially if it's in a city somewhere, but those earlier records don't list streets, but
No,
they kind of went along in order of houses. So,
Right.
If they're nearby in the listing on the pages,
it
but they were
was,
not very far away.
right.
I mean, if they're right next to each other in the census, obviously they live next door, but a couple pages later, they weren't that far away.
Right.
The other helpful thing too is I've encountered this with some of my research is to obtain plat maps. Plat maps are how the plats are divided in a particular county or town, and will identify the owners of those plats. So you can see right off the bat who are the neighbors, the adjoining neighbors.
So is this part of the census?
No,
No.
this
I
would be
guess-
like this would be like a land record.
But
Well, that could be an
some of the
interesting-
census have the maps of enumeration districts.
Enumeration districts, right?
Yes. This-
I'm not sure how far back, but the more recent census definitely would have them. Further back in time, I'm not quite
Yeah,
as
yeah,
sure.
definitely, especially in more densely populated areas. The other thing is to refer to the instructions to the enumerators, which are at the you can access those at the National Archives.
Okay,
Each census year had an instruction to tell a enumerator, well, if you encounter this situation, this is how you should, report this on your sheet.
well,
And those
that
are
would be an interesting thing to explore perhaps in another,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know, another meeting.
I'll try to remember. I'll put a note, and maybe I can send you the link, everybody, the
Yeah.
link, where to find those.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Wayne, and thank you, everyone. It's always interesting, and I keep trying to make inroads, and a couple of the greats are really hard to pin down.
Sometimes they are.
Persistence
But
is,
again, yeah, thanks again for everybody participating.
well,
Are you gonna have this on YouTube, this meeting
Yes.
today?
yes,
My
we,
husband all of a sudden he didn't get an email, so he missed the whole thing. He had to go to the other meeting today.
yeah, we will do that. We'll
Okay,
send you a link to the YouTube.
okay,
And-
thanks.
Okay,
Mark January 18th on your calendars, 11
Okay.
a.m. And
But-
we're going to try it live at Brooks Memorial Library as well as Zoomed. So you'll see a room with some people in it if you're doing it Zoom.
Yeah, it would be Zoom for me for sure. Connecticut.
But yeah, definitely.
okay.
But I wouldn't make the trip up here unless you want to go out to
I have
dinner.
relatives, but I still probably won't come. I probably not, it might be snowing by that date. You never know.
True.
Weather will,
Yeah, that's why it's nice. We can just resort to Zoom.
right. I love it. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks for
And
coming.
thanks.
All right, thank you.
Have a good day. Have a
Thanks. Take care.
Okay, have a nice
Bye,
holiday.
everybody.
Nice holiday, everybody.
Okay, bye now.